Yes.
Good to see you,
Thank
Louise,
you.
as well. Thanks for joining.
Hi, Louise. Thank you. So I'm going to share some slides in a second and talk you through some research that I've just completed. I'll explain some of the context as we go, but what I'd really encourage, if we don't get to the end of the slides, that's absolutely fine. If we have conversations along the way, that might be even better. So I suppose my ambition is not to get to the end of what I'm going to talk about, and hopefully we'll stir up a conversation along the way. So let's get everything working. So you'll see a little stick figure on the screen. Let's call him Fred this morning. It could be anyone. And really the reason for doing this research is only a few decades ago, we're talking kind of 20 or 30 years ago, lots of the research talked about employees as cognitive stick figures, that all the stuff they have going on in their lives didn't impact what happened at work. And that kind of just didn't feel right. So what I was really interested in is how things have changed and what role emotion played in the workplace today. So before we progress too far, I probably should say who I am. So my name is Paul. I'm a leader in education, which is how I met Sarah, and generally fascinated by the role that emotion can play in the workplace. Sarah posted out on LinkedIn a few days ago about this talk, and one of the things that really jumped out in the comments was lots of people very quickly gravitated to, yes, it's really important. Think about the people that change is enacted upon and their emotions in this. What the research will hopefully show and we'll talk through is actually the role and the emotional labour and emotional burden on leaders themselves who are enacting change. So just to kind of a bit of heads up, maybe a bit of a spot spoiler, we're going to talk about leaders and the role of emotion on them as much as the people that are subject to change. So very quickly, a little bit about what we did. So as I say, my research was interested in how leaders navigated change, particularly how navigated emotions and others. I reviewed literature on emotional intelligence, on change management and ruinous empathy. So if anyone's read Radical Candor by Kim Scott, there's quite a lot in there kind of about being nice and kind and the difference between those kind of two concepts. I interviewed senior leaders about the experience, and one of the things that was really, really amazing, I think, is they were unbelievably candid about their experience and about the role that emotion played when they were managing change processes or change periods, to the extent that one leader started kind of in tears because they had just gone through a restructure and had a conversation with someone they had been managing for quite a long period of time, and it brought out kind of a bit of an outburst of emotion. So the stories are very real and very deeply personal. So I looked at their responses, we kind of went through those, and 5 core themes emerged, which I'll talk about in a second. And I think what we'll kind of hope to end with is going through the 5 themes, and I'll share with you some of the verbatim quotes that have come through, a little bit about what the research says, and I've kind of posed some questions to maybe take away to your own organisation that you can think about as well. So I suppose kind of getting to the grip of this was the position 30 years ago, this idea of cognitive stick figures. Have things changed? To what extent? And to what extent are leaders capable and equipped to deal with emotion at work? And if you think this is against a backdrop of rising poor mental health, cost of living, move to much more hybrid work, much more kind of disparate teams. So organisations have quite significantly changed over the last 5 to 6 years as well. So that was kind of some of the context that we were looking at. So what kind of things really, really jumped out and came through? The 5 core themes were what you see on the screen. The emotional impact of change, generally on 3 groups. The people that were obviously undergoing or having the change kind of imposed upon them, the leaders enacting the change, and then the wider stakeholder body around that. So one individual described a colleague who had moved apartment as a result of a restructure, feeling like a divorce, that they had so many habits and routines and how they worked together that actually the breakdown of their working relationship, just moving to a different department about 50 meters away in the building, felt like a divorce. And that felt a really powerful kind of a message. Second point was around emotional labor of leadership, and the emotional toll or the emotional burden that leaders face. And I'll explain a little bit about that and show some quotations in a second. Really, really clearly, change management and change had succeeded or failed on the quality of communication and the transparency with which things were communicated. There was a very clear message. The phrase corporate jargon came up huge amounts. People wanted real messages with humility and some self-depreciation. They didn't want kind of standard text that went out to every employee. And it was about recognizing difference in individuals. The bit that I really loved about the research, which feels a little bit perverse, but the kind of the fourth one down is around the people performance paradox. There's some research in the 70s and 80s that talks about espoused versus enacted values, i.e., organizations say one thing on the walls and do another thing in practice. And it was a really clear message that come through that this was really difficult for leaders and staff to manage. They had kind of a vision, a mission for an organization, and they wanted to work in a certain way. But sometimes their performance targets were kind of colliding and clashing with that. And the kind of care versus KPIs is how one leader described it. They said, I really do want to be a people first manager and care for the staff. However, and as soon as the however came into what they were saying, it kind of made me jolt up a little bit. They said, however, I have targets to meet, and sometimes the compassion that I want for the staff doesn't quite chime well with the targets I'm trying to achieve. And then finally, I asked all leaders about the capabilities and the attributes and skills they feel helped in these situations. And what you'll see from the research I'll share in a second was that often these had been developed accidentally, and people had often been trained on the process of change, but not the emotional fallout before, during, or after. So that's a bit of a summary of kind of some of the findings. I suppose before we kind of dig into those a little bit more, though, we should kind of consider whether all of this is positive. So your guess, the reason for the talk is I think emotionally intelligent, emotionally agile leadership is really powerful. However, as part of the research, it was really important to go and look at what might be an issue with this sometimes. And the research is really clear that actually being too empathetic, going too far with some of this stuff, being a family, that was a phrase that came up quite a lot in the research, can sometimes be detrimental. It stops you having the conversation that's needed because you're so concerned for how that other person might respond. It puts a bit of a blocker in the way. And then the kind of piece of research down in the bottom right corner really resonated as well. So there's some research that kind of showed that actually we tend to empathize with people that are like us. And if that's the case, then the flip of that is we're probably pushing away or lacking empathy with those that are unlike us. And the research is quite hard hitting. It actually kind of looks at empathy and xenophobia being kind of hand in hand. They're two sides of the same coin. If we empathize with people that are like us and we don't make active decisions to kind of get out of that bubble a little bit, that can be quite dangerous for the culture of an organization. So the next kind of 4 or 5 slides, I'm just going to share some of the things that people said verbatim and some of my summary around it, and then we'll kind of start to pull that together. So emotional impact of change. As I said, this was on various stakeholder groups. And what was really clear is that change is as much an emotional process as it is a structural one or a policy-driven one. And people talked about even when change is really, really positive, it sets anxiety going. And someone talked about an initiative that had been put into an organisation that was wholly positive, but they were so worried about what the fallout might be for them and how it might change their job and what that uncertainty might be, that they had this increased feeling of anxiety. The second bit, as I was saying, people described feeling like naughty children through restructures, that they'd been doing a really good job, but funding had changed or policy had changed and their role was no longer needed in the same way. It had to go somewhere else. And they're described as feeling like naughty children being moved away, which again kind of struck with me. But there was this overriding message that actually, if communication isn't really clear and there's not a relationship between those enacting the change and those that are recipient of it, and those who are enacting it haven't been kind of trained in some of this stuff, that emotion just becomes blinding and the kind of direction of travel gets a little bit lost in lots of noise. The other thing I think that was really clear in this element was that there are psychological, physiological, and behavioural responses to change. People describe feeling genuinely unwell. They also talked about kind of increased heart rate. They also talked about how they were then acting differently outside of work. They talked about being irritable with their partner or their children, etc., and the kind of the wider impact of change not necessarily being considered. And one of the messages that came through here again was that, linking back to the culture, that culture becomes really, really visible when change happens because people have to make active choices rather than just letting things go. And you see which way they're going to make those choices. And that kind of says a lot about the nature of the organisation. So the emotional impact of change as well. So this is about leaders who spoke about the emotional toll of leading change and the emotional labour of it. I've put some of the things that jumped out in red, but it was really hard-hitting language. Leaders spoke about horrific days, feeling traumatised, feeling discombobulated. It was a great word. And everyone associated change in organisation generally with restructure. And there was this kind of negative correlation between the two. Multiple leaders, and it was really interesting. So these people had never been kind of briefed or primed on what we were going to talk about. Talked about being an emotional sponge, which is an unusual phrase in itself, but 2 or 3 leaders used exactly the same phrase, which is why it resonated so much. And they felt that they were there absorbing all of the pressures up from the organisation, down from the organisation, laterally, and kind of carrying that with them. And then talked about the burden that placed on them trying to do their job and how they move through that as well. And one leader really spoke that they were trying to maintain this hugely positive facade and felt it exhausting. But going back to this idea of kind of toxic positivity, that actually they just didn't let it go and go, you know what, this is really, really difficult, and kind of didn't jump in with that. Communication was a really central thing that change was seen to make or break often on how effective communication was. And one of the messages that came through really clearly is if you leaders who enact change have often been in the board meeting where it's first discussed, they've seen the data, they've been stewing on the idea probably for months, sometimes years. They've been able to socialise it and think about it. But the people, when that's then communicated to, have only just heard it. And there's a real disconnect between how well formed their view of what needs to happen is. And leaders talked about this idea of not being able to translate change because there was an assumption that the people that were being told about it had all the background information and kind of baggage that had come with the decision as the leader had. And that just wasn't the case. There's a really clear message as well through corporate messaging, being honest, being humble, having humility, being very personal and human in the messaging, talking through the difficulty of what it meant, and kind of sense of integrity and humility really jumps out. And no matter how difficult the messaging was, if this was done in the right way, actually people understood and got on board with really challenging situations and kind of cooperated and worked with and collaborated. And then generally, communication being tailored to the individual. Some of the people that spoke talked about people undergoing restructure where they'd maybe just signed up to a mortgage versus someone who was coming to the end of their career and about to retire. Those two people are going to receive that news and information in quite different ways. And as a kind of a leader, you need to kind of know that and navigate those conversations. So having a blanket one size fits all corporate message, while sometimes from a kind of a policy or a legality might make sense, actually it does a disservice to the people in the room that are hearing that message. As I say, the kind of favourite finding really, the 2 passages here, I just wanted to take a little read through. So talking about people first cultures, but numbers still dominating, and that was a real tension throughout the research. So leaders described this feeling torn between being compassionate and being directive. And lots of these contrasts appeared throughout, and they felt like they were on a dichotomy. The second bit was when pressure kicks in, when deadlines are approaching, when performance is slipping. People often talked about there being a fine balance between getting the job done and looking after people. And I was really, really surprised that very few talked about that being the same thing. They talked about it as two separate ideas, which kind of took me by surprise a little bit. Surely getting the job done and looking after people is the same thing. But actually, leaders often spoke about those in quite separate terms. One leader even said when there is a balance between the two, the job wins, and by default, the person doesn't. And then the quote being, we talk a good game around leadership, but don't enact it very well. So coming from this idea of being espoused versus enacted values. So actually, again, I think culture really comes to the fore. People really see what your culture is like and feel it when there's decisions to be made and when performance and compassion appear to collide in leadership decision making. So as the pressure rises, organisations discover whether they really are a people-first organisation or not. So some of the skills and capabilities that came through, we'll kind of leave it on the right. The little diagram in the bottom right corner, though, is really important because actually what was really essential is leaders often talked about managing change, managing the fallout of change, just kind of falling into it rather than being trained or developed. They understood the process, they've been coached in the process and what to do and what to say, but very few had actually been trained on the kind of people element of it, the emotional intelligence part of it. And they had kind of just been assumed that they would manage that because they're managers and they work with people. But actually, there was a real gap in training around that. And as I say at the bottom, that's really important before to leaders and the staff feel well prepared to give and receive messages around change and to work with that during the change itself. And then after, there felt a very kind of cliff edge drop. Leaders spoke about after a change had done, consultancy periods have ended, people have left an organisation, moved into new roles. It was kind of never talked about again. And actually, that's when emotion was running highest and people were finding their feet and finding new ways of working and really trying to engage with a new self at work. That's often where the support really stopped. So been talking through quite quickly, so I'll give you 5 takeaways against each of the questions, and they're questions I'd like you to take away and think about in your own organisation. So it'd be interesting to see and kind of reflect on how change feels in your organisation when it happens. Do people experience it as something just strategic, exciting, new opportunities, or does it leave them feeling really uncertain and personal? And does it feel very disruptive? How visible is the emotional leadership of leaders? Do we talk about it? Do we recognise the burden that leaders face during periods of change? Do we put all of our time and energy into the people that the changes are enacted upon? Around communication, how honest are we? Do we rely too much and fall back on the safety net of corporate organisational messaging? Or do we really kind of get in amongst it and talk to people? And then this idea of when the pressure rises, is it performance or people that take centre stage? And is there a better balance of those two that we can navigate? And just at the end, really, I suppose, the thing that I would ask is, what would you change in your organisation if you treated kind of emotions as a really significant part of leadership and treated it as importantly as a strategic imperative when working with people? Would you lead differently? Would you act differently? Would your organisation feel different? Sarah, I'm trying to keep to time and I'm talking through very quickly, as I appreciate. So the other thing I can only leave you with, the first 2 books on this list were kind of my starting point. So Daniel Goleman from Leadership, he's a bit of a guru in this space. Following that, Susan David around emotional agility, which is about putting this into practice. But there were some others as well. The book in the middle was really fascinating. Helena Bosch is a psychologist and looks at the kind of neuroscience and cognitive science behind the way people act. And it's one of the takeaways from the research, actually, that understanding people, looking at the cognitive function, how people act, how they learn, can really help how we lead people through some of this as well. Thank you. Sarah, I will pass back over to you.
Thank you.